And we're live.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to ISGP's The Forum, the official podcast of the Institute on Science for Global Policy. As you know, today we're coming to you with a very special live episode as the fifth and final session of Climate Geoengineering GeoE Live, the Forum's second ever virtual conference. For those of you who are new to our podcast, we normally don't do this live, just FYI. My name is Aubrey, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Cleo and Daniela.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cleo, and don't worry, I'm still just as mortified about the possibility of messing up live on air this time as I was during SynBio Live, which was our first live episode back in March.
You're mortified? Last time I checked, I'm the one that has to re-record parts of each episode 5 times over if there are more than 2 words in a row starting with the same letter.
And that was Daniela, everyone.
Hi.
Alrighty, so before we get started on the content of this special episode, we'd like to remind all of our listeners, or I guess viewers if you're watching us on YouTube today. Anyway, just a reminder to tweet us your thoughts using the forum's Twitter handle at ISGP Forum, and you can also post on our Facebook page at facebook.com/ISGP Forum.
For this episode specifically, be sure to tag your tweets and posts with hashtag GeoELive so that all the other virtual attendees of this virtual conference can see what you have to say. So let's strike up some conversations.
All right, so just so we're all on the same page, GeoE Live kicked off today with an interview discussing the concept of geoengineering. Then there were panels on solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal, and just before this session, we released a fun segment on public perceptions of geoengineering.
Yeah, and now to round out this conversation, this podcast episode will discuss governance of climate geoengineering. I know, right? The forum talking about governance and policy. I'm so sure you didn't see that one coming.
So, as usual, we're going to start off with a little context about why a governance conversation needs to happen now. Or, I don't know, like maybe yesterday or a year ago.
Or 5 years ago.
Or that.
Okay, so why geoengineering in the first place? Is that the context you're going for here, Cleo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's appropriate, especially for anyone who couldn't watch the earlier Geo Live sessions that happened today.
Okay, so the big question we're addressing here is how can we limit global temperature increases that threaten humanity? And the obvious answer is, well, we stop or limit the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere.
Yeah, but unfortunately, though, there is a big question about whether or not countries will actually be able to reduce their emissions fast enough to prevent catastrophic warming. Back around 2007, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimated that global emissions would need to be reduced by 50 to 85% of year 2000 levels in order to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Well, spoiler alert, people, it's 2017, and that hasn't happened.
What Daniela and Aubrey are getting at here is the fact that we might not be able to stop greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to not use geoengineering. This sentiment was made pretty clear by the IPCC 7 years later in 2014, when its report basically said that keeping temperatures from increasing by more than 2 degrees Celsius would require, quote, direct modification of the atmosphere, end quote. Not consider, not research, not explore, but require.
And that's a pretty significant statement, especially when you consider that the 2015 Paris Agreement goals set during COP21 essentially focus on this 2 degrees Celsius figure being the maximum temperature increase that would minimize devastation.
This leads us to geoengineering as one possible set of solutions to what is truly a global problem. According to the Royal Society, geoengineering is defined as the deliberate large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment to counteract anthropogenic climate change. The overall purpose here is to cool the Earth's atmosphere, and strategies for doing so are typically split into two categories.
Okay, so there's CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal, and that includes techniques like capturing and sequestering CO2 underground, fertilizing the ocean to increase photosynthesis, or dissolving limestone in the ocean to increase its carbon storage ability and address ocean acidification.
And then on the SRM or solar radiation management side, there's talk of increasing the reflectiveness of clouds or land, putting solar reflectors in space, or probably the most talked about option, injecting small reflective aerosols into the stratosphere to limit the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth.
Now, the term geoengineering first came to use sometime in the 1970s, but the concept itself didn't really enter mainstream debate until the 1990s. Man, I mean, who know the 90s could be known for anything besides the peak Backstreet Boys and NSYNC era? Those two bands, you gotta love them.
I don't know, Cleo. I actually can't agree with you there. Everyone knows that you had to be either Team Backstreet Boys or Team NSYNC. You couldn't be both, and the right answer was always Backstreet Boys.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you there. I mean, NSYNC taught me probably most of my English, so I gotta
Really?
give it to them.
Yeah, and they brought the world Justin Timberlake, so there's that as well.
Another one. Whatever. I Want It That Way is obviously the song of our generation. So moving on. While the 90s brought with them the onset of the climate GOE debate, the reason this debate has continued is because of an overall failure of the world to limit its emissions, which has put geoengineering technologies in the spotlight.
But what exactly is this debate? Well, we'll end the show later on with some discussion of public perceptions of these technologies. But a really common question is whether it's better to implement geoengineering or to reduce carbon emissions, since these are both possible solutions to the same problem.
And please let us be clear. Experts agree that warding off global temperature increases and other environmental problems by reducing emissions is always preferable.
But all the same, geoengineering has become a real candidate here because its possible impacts would be realized much faster than emissions reductions.
For these reasons, requests for more research on geoengineering have found their way into reports from the bigwigs of science, really. We're talking the US National Academy of Sciences and the UK Royal Society here, and even the Bipartisan Policy Center.
And this is where the governance question begins, and begins with some complications. I think you'll find that this whole conversation is going to be like one of those really old roller coasters at the Jersey Boardwalk. From the moment you get on it, there's like all these major bumps and abrupt turns, and it's immediately clear that there's not going to be a single stretch of good ride.
You're giving me major flashbacks here to Rolling Thunder at Six Flags. I don't know whose idea it was to get rid of it, or I don't even remember when it happened, but it was the best idea. Anyway, continue.
All right, regardless, it's actually a pretty good analogy, Cleo. Right off the bat, governance is simply fraught with complexities. The first is regulation of research versus implementation. You see, normally scientific research has its own set of self-policing regulations, primarily maintained by things like the peer review process and ethics boards. But when it comes to geoengineering, some of the most important stages of research necessarily involve testing in the field.
Because of the need for direct testing, distinguishing research from implementation is actually pretty tricky, and it begs the question of whether research needs to be regulated in a more overarching, less self-policing fashion, just like implementation.
Okay, so hopefully it's clear now that we have an international challenge on our hands too. I mean, think about it. If you inject particles into the stratosphere, they're not just going to stay right where you put them. It's a little bit like antibiotic resistance, actually, right? So the whole world doesn't have to partake for the whole world to be affected.
Exactly. And in the case of geoengineering, unlike antibiotic resistance, that phenomena could manifest as either a good thing or a bad thing. If agreed on by everyone, a handful of countries could implement these technologies and the whole world could benefit. On the other extreme, though, of course, is that one or a handful of countries goes rogue and starts geoengineering on its own, impacting everyone, despite whether or not the impact is good or bad.
Right. And that is why international governance is so darn important. But before we get to talking about what's actually going on in the international sphere, let's briefly ask this governance question of the United States. Where are we at here? Are we even thinking about regulating GOE?
All right, so on the domestic side of things, not too much really seems to be going on governance-wise. It kind of seems like we're at a weird standstill. We're not exactly sure how to regulate these new technologies because of how new they are, and the uncertainties associated with them are just crazy. So, but I thought we could discuss some current US geoengineering projects, which might help us start envisioning regulatory suggestions.
Are you thinking of the Harvard study?
I am indeed. So, sometime next year, Harvard professors David Keith and Frank Koich hope to launch a high altitude balloon from a site in Tucson, Arizona. The balloon would be tethered to a gondola equipped with propellers and sensors, and it would spray a small quantity of reflective particles into the stratosphere so that we could see what SRM could look like in practice. Their idea was actually proposed in 2014, so it's moving along fairly quickly in the grand scheme of things.
And so this is actually a pretty big deal. Only two known experiments have been carried out to date in the open air that could be considered geoengineering related. One of these experiments was performed by University of California, San Diego researchers who sprayed smoke and salt particles off the coast of California as part of the EPEACE project in 2011. EPEACE, by the way, stands for Eastern Pacific Emitted Aerosol Cloud Experiment, so I'm sure you can see why they chose the much simpler acronym.
And the other experiment was performed by scientists in Russia who dispersed aerosols from a helicopter and car in 2009.
Yeah, so not too much previous research to work off of here. And when it comes to regulating these projects, we've got even less to go on. It has been suggested, though, that we use a system of evaluation based on levels of disturbance and environmental impact to determine whether or not certain types of GOE research experiments can move forward.
And this sort of already exists in the US, but it applies to general actions impacting the environment as opposed to geoengineering specifically. To give you a concrete example, there's the US National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This act reviews federal activities that will affect environmental quality and make sure that public process is explored to discuss alternatives. This, for instance, applies to seismic surveys of the ocean.
NEPA does not regulate or prohibit actions. Rather, it guides the investigation of impact level, facilitates public comment, and provides alternatives. It also requires environmental impact assessments, which are the highest level of assessment, by the way, for projects that are controversial or politically charged. So we might imagine this sort of regulation expanding to apply to geoengineering.
Then there's another angle that people have suggested in terms of regulation in the US, and that's actually using the established framework of human subject review boards. Now, these, of course, are usually implemented for clinical trials and other experiments involving people, but researchers could theoretically use them to determine whether geoengineering risks would apply to certain populations disproportionately over others.
And that's the regulatory story in the United States right now. It's really just comprised of speculation. International governance of GOE, on the other hand, has been a little bit more productive.
Yeah, I'm sure there's more to talk about internationally here.
Yeah, okay, guys. Well, I tried to pull in some domestic information.
It's not your fault, Cleo, we know that. Most governance conversations involve international regulation of things like ocean iron fertilization because, well, geoengineering governance is a collective action problem. And it turns out that there are two main agreements to talk about here. One, established in 1972, called the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste and Other Matter.
You mean the London Convention?
Yeah, in much simpler terms, it's also called the London Convention. This is one of the first global conventions to protect the marine environment from human activities, and it's been in force since 1975. Its objective is to promote the control of all sources of marine pollution.
And currently, 87 states are parties to this convention.
Okay, so that's the London Convention, but then we have the London Protocol too, right?
Yeah. So the London Protocol was established in 1996 and was meant to replace the original convention. Under the London Protocol, all dumping is prohibited except for acceptable waste on the so-called reverse list. It entered into force on March 24th, 2006, and there are currently 48 parties to the protocol.
Okay, that's great, but what does that have to do with geoengineering?
No, I see where we're going with this. Ocean iron fertilization for sure.
Aubrey, always on top of the ball. So,
Oh,
yes.
thanks.
So, the contracting parties to both the convention and the protocol agreed on an assessment framework for ocean iron fertilization, or OIF, since we like to minimize our tongue twisters on this show.
No, that's not entirely true. Quite the opposite, actually. I try to keep as many tongue twisters as possible and trick you, Daniela, into saying them all.
All right, so I'm not crazy after all.
Well, I didn't say that.
All right, whatever. Moving on. So, this assessment framework that I mentioned serves as a barrier to large-scale commercial OIF projects, which would pose the greatest threat of marine pollution.
And then for researchers, the framework requires that, quote, expected impacts on the environment be slight, if any, end quote, for these OIF experiments to proceed.
But we do have to recognize that the London Convention and protocol's reaches are limited to the states that have voluntarily agreed to them.
That is true, but when you look at the history of international law, this is actually how binding international agreements typically begin, on a voluntary basis. After a while, voluntary customs become international norms, which, in this case, might set standards for the regulation of OIF. Hey, have you guys ever seen that video about social norm creation with the woman in the waiting room and the people standing up?
I'm not sure I know what you're talking about.
No worries, Aubrey. I think everyone who knows Daniela is well aware of the unnecessary amount of time she wastes on Facebook watching viral videos.
Oh.
Okay, fine, that's very true. But I swear this one is actually relevant. So, it's basically a social experiment. A woman walks into a waiting room and everyone in the room stands up. Then she sits down and the rest sit down. But everyone else keeps standing up when a new person walks in. Feeling pressured to follow along with the rest of the group, the original woman begins standing up when someone new comes in. Slowly but surely, everyone in the original group is called in to see their doctor, and new people keep coming in. The first woman, who has no idea why she's been standing up in the first place, just keeps the trend going, and each new person that walks in follows her lead until the original group is replaced with a new group. Do you get what I'm saying?
It kind of sounds like peer pressure to me.
Well, in a way it is, but this is how international norms are made, and it plays a really big role in international regulation. Some behavior becomes so socially customary that breaking away from the group brings some sort of shame.
So the point you're getting at is that even though the convention and protocol are voluntary, they're likely to establish international norms and standards for the regulation of OIF.
Exactly. But while I don't mean to diminish the importance of this, it's also important to remember that this framework is for OIF only, not geoengineering as a whole.
Right. While OIF governance should look towards the London Convention and maybe even the Convention on Biological Diversity, stratospheric aerosol injection should look towards the Montreal Protocol and the Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention.
So, the Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention, being pretty straightforward in its name, is often abbreviated as just air pollution, or CLR-TAP, and it's intended to gradually reduce and prevent air pollution. It's implemented by the European Monitoring and Evaluation Program and directed by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe.
The Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, aka just Montreal Protocol, is an international treaty designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the use of substances responsible for ozone depletion. It was adopted in 1987 and has 46 parties on board.
Okay, but a key fact still remains here. GOE as a whole is largely missing from international law, and no international body is monitoring these ongoing GOE research projects.
These projects are somewhat governed by jurisdictional rules, specifically rules dealing with territorial and extraterritorial sovereignty, which attempt to determine which state can exercise authority over which other states and in what circumstances. This is relevant to geoengineering because well, we've already discussed how geoengineering affects everyone.
So, in general, customary laws apply to scenarios when no specific international law exists. Basically, this means that GOE could be governed by global and regional agreements dealing with environmental problems. Some examples might be CLR TAPS protocols dealing with sulfur emissions,
Or the duty to prevent transboundary harm, or the precautionary principle.
or the prohibition of environmental modification for military or hostile purposes, or the duty to protect the marine environment.
Or basically, we could apply this to any international law.
Well, not any, but seeing as everything is connected, heck, I feel like we could even argue that GOE could be necessary for climate change adaptation under the right to an adequate standard of living. Although I guess you could argue that one both ways.
Okay, so it's about how far the application of a law can be defended.
Isn't all law?
Well played.
Oh, touche.
Sorry, watching too much Suits. So, anyway, all in all, we need to decide under which international regimes or institutions GOE belongs. In other words, which international body should make decisions related to geoengineering? Environmental entities such as the UNFCCC or ones focusing on technology? Should we have a new regulatory regime entirely?
And these questions wouldn't be so difficult to answer if it weren't for one main issue, liability.
Right. Considering that no one owns the open oceans, who's actually responsible for unintended consequences that could occur over them or even in them? Or, I guess for that matter, who's responsible for consequences of atmospheric actions that affect neighboring jurisdictions?
If unintended consequences do occur, how does compensation get determined? And I mean, who would be doing the compensating?
Not to mention the fact that we always have to keep power dynamics in mind. Wealthier nations are better poised to be vocal and influential in global debates about technical issues like GOE because they have more people educated in researching the technology.
But don't get us wrong, furthering research in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Innovation in this kind of technology is absolutely crucial, it's key, but it does need to be balanced with appropriate regulation.
So, with the past 5 minutes as context, a few international governance solutions have been suggested in the literature. Ready? Good.
Okay, so first, we could have an overarching treaty to deal with GOE strategies in a comprehensive manner. The benefit is that such a treaty would be broad and all-encompassing. The drawback is that it would be broad and all-encompassing. So the broader the treaty, the less in-depth it's likely to be on individual points, or in this case, individual geoengineering strategies.
So, a second solution is that we could keep the current ad hoc approach of dealing under existing treaties, but we'd have to elaborate specific rules that cover particular techniques and situations. We could do this with, say, the London Convention and Protocol, for instance.
Third, it's been suggested we could once again continue with the current approach, but this time enhance regime cooperation and interaction. This means having existing regulatory bodies that seem relevant to the subject and actually cooperate, such as the UNFCCC and the International Maritime Organization.
So in this case, many proponents argue that there's no real reason here to create new regulatory bodies when existing treaties or organizations appear to be sufficient.
So, a fourth proposition entails implementing a multilateral authorization process for case by case geoengineering projects, which would operate by, say, issuing permits for individual projects.
Yeah, but it's unlikely that countries would be willing to turn over their geoengineering decisions to an international body. Having a body available for consultation and to generally be informed when decisions are made by a state might be better.
True, and many groups do already self govern. Though not a national group, one such example is the development of the Oxford Principles on Regulation of Geoengineering by a team at, you guessed it, Oxford. And these self designed codes of conduct could be expanded.
That actually reminds me, we're forgetting one final proposed solution, and it'd probably be appealing to some scientists out there. So it could be pretty powerful if scientists who are already working on GOE research actually collected themselves and established a governance framework, much like the assessment framework, but not just limited to OIF.
I think that in any case, if there's just some international body designated as the geoengineering oversight team or some document delineating the GeoE rules, it might alleviate a lot of public concern about using these technologies.
That is a really good point because when it comes to implementing regulatory or governance frameworks, public perception of the regulated or governed thing probably comes to mind. At least if you've ever listened to our podcast before, I certainly hope it comes to mind because if it doesn't, then we're probably not doing a very good job.
Well, it should definitely come to mind in the geoengineering equation, especially if you watched Forum on the Street, the session right before this one on GeoE Live.
But if you haven't yet, be sure to go check out Forum on the Street over at facebook.com/ISGP Forum. Long story short, Aubrey, Cleo, and I, plus a few friends of the forum, Diana and Sam, actually went out on the streets in 8 cities and 4 countries to talk to random people about their thoughts on climate geoengineering.
Yes, we talked to many poor, unsuspecting souls who probably never dreamed that they'd be approached by a camera and interviewer that day when they left the house. But they were all very kind and great sports.
That's for sure. But I think a poignant takeaway message from the resulting video is that there's an enormous range in terms of how much people actually know about geoengineering. Some people knew exactly what we were talking about, and others had literally never heard the term before in their lives. And I don't know, I don't really think there was a trend in knowledge based on country or region. People in the US seemed equally likely to be confused as people in the UK or Mexico or Denmark.
Well, I think Forum on the Street was effective for 2 reasons. First, it's pretty funny. I mean, we got some pretty great answers from the people we talked to. My personal favorite was probably the comment about the giant disco ball. Anyway, second, the amount of data out there on public perceptions of geoengineering is actually relatively small.
True, but of the data that do exist, scientifically derived trends do seem to match what we found out on the streets. Go us. But what I mean is, according to a 2010 study, only 8% of people could correctly define the term geoengineering.
And when the public is confused or uncertain or simply lacks knowledge about GeoE, that makes life way more difficult for policymakers when they try to decide what to do about governance.
Yeah, that's right. You cannot have informed consent from the public if the public doesn't know what they're consenting, by definition.
Mixed signals or fear from the public hinders effective governance of any technology. I mean, we've seen examples time and time again on this show. GMOs or vaccines, anyone?
Well, one of the biggest fears of many who don't know what to think about GOE directly implicates policymakers. Namely, there's huge concern over whether establishing GOE governance and then finding ways to implement it would take pressure off of global leaders to reduce carbon emissions.
Oh, I see. Okay, so they wonder if by saying yes to the dress, we'd be saying no to the other less risky dresses.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty much it if you can envision geoengineering and CO2 emissions as dresses.
CO2 emissions would definitely be a gray and ugly one. I just know it.
Yeah, so how obvious is it that we've been ignoring our work and just binging on TLC? What's next?
Actually, I think that's pretty much it for us.
Oh, thank God, because it was definitely Daniela and not me who was starting to get weird.
Always me. Love you too, Cleo. Anyway, so recap time then.
Okay, so for today's special live episode, we endeavored to explain the complexities associated with geoengineering governance, why those complexities exist in the first place, where we're at on the domestic international levels, and where a public perception of these techniques currently stands.
Long story short, the nature of geoengineering immediately suggests a need for regulation and agreements at the international level. And some existing protocols already exist that could be used to shape a new, as yet non-existent, global framework.
So after today's episode and all the other sessions of GOE Live that aired today, what are your thoughts on climate geoengineering?
Do you think we're at a point where establishing a governance framework is necessary? Let us know on Twitter at ISGP Forum or on Facebook at facebook.com/ISGP Forum.
Okay, so before I close this out, I think we should leave you all with a really great comparison that I wish I could take credit for, but I can't. In a book chapter, Columbia University professor Scott Barrett compares climate geoengineering to the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Barrett noted that in Brave New World, humans were engineered to maintain social stability, and technology was implemented or exploited following a self-inflicted disaster. When it comes to our scenario today, of course, the Earth could be engineered to maintain climate stability, and geoengineering technology could be implemented or exploited to prevent disaster.
Loving the literature shout out. So to me, that's a perfect comparison.
Well, not quite though. Barrett points out that there is one big difference here. In Brave New World, human engineering was performed by a quote unquote world state. When it comes to climate GOE, who knows? It could be performed by a single state, a coalition of states, or somewhere in between. Proactivity, or lack thereof, on the international governance front will probably determine where on that scale we end up.
What an end to a show.
All right. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in to Climate Geoengineering, GOE Live, and of course, for socializing with science today. We are Aubrey, Cleo, and Daniela from the Institute on Science for Global Policy, and we'll catch you next time right here on the forum.